Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon, everyone. And first of all, thank you for being here today with us. We know how difficult navigating this COP is, especially with the immense amount of participants here at this COP in Dubai, the COP for Action, as it has been said during the opening ceremony. So we deeply appreciate your commitment and your attendance to this high-level event. My name is Sanchez, and I work for UN Climate Change, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this high-level event on Together for Transparency. So now that we're together, let's talk a bit why we are here, and I believe it is for three reasons. First, because we believe in the Paris Agreement and what it stands for. Second, because we know we must limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. And last but not least, because we know we can't do it in silos. We know we need collaboration, and we need to foster collaboration and partnerships with all groups of society. And this is exactly what Together for Transparency does. This is a UN climate change initiative that mobilizes both parties and non-party stakeholders to actively promote and implement transparency of climate action and support. This event is part of the Together for Transparency series on transparency, and we have a high number of events here at COP. We invite you to attend those. And to that end, I would like to introduce and invite to the floor Mr. Donald Cooper, Director of the Transparency Division here at the UN Climate Change. Don, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jessica. I expected her to say something really eye-catching about me, but she started, and then she stopped. Now, I assume she stopped because the thing she were about to say was so earth-shattering, it might overwhelm the entire meeting. I'm certain it couldn't be because she couldn't think of anything to say. And Jessica is a very, very promising member of our team. And I just want to remind her that sometimes it's nice to say the odd good thing about the boss. It goes over surprisingly well. The one thing about working in the UN, nothing you say can get you a negative comment, but lots of things you say can get you a positive one. There you go. I was having an in-depth conversation with our next speaker, Rolph, and we thought, you know, in this world that we live in with all the tough decisions governments and companies have to make, we've seen a coming together of all sectors, all levels, and they've come together on one important point. There is a lot of walking to do at all of these COPs, and it is taking a toll on people's feet. So it's been a unanimous decision that we will stop wearing shoes and start wearing tennis shoes. So now that you have seen or heard this, check out people's feet as you walk from place to place and see how people are beginning to become so comfortable in their capabilities that they've decided to be comfortable in their footwear. Now that we've gotten the tough stuff out of the way, welcome, and all of you people in the ether, welcome as well. I have listen to how many times so far today transparency has been used. And to be honest with you, every time I hear it, I cringe a little bit, because it really doesn't mean anything. It's what the parties put together to cover that group of very difficult decisions that they had to take. And what it represents to them today is completely different from what it represented even 3 years ago. So what we are working on is transparency as defined for the Enhanced Transparency Framework. where reporting globally is no longer the principal driver for parties. Having national ability to make socioeconomic development decisions is the driving factor. To understand what happens in your economy, the social context, religious, historical, indigenous people, healthcare, agriculture, fisheries, energy, all of those, to understand them. Yes, if you understand them better, you can take decisions on how to improve them for yourself, not for the global community. This makes it far more sustainable. If you are able to understand, you are able to manage. You're able to set goals. And if you're not reaching your goals, you can change what you are doing. Oh, by the way, that is exactly the same information that you'll fill in the box when you do your biennial transparency report submission. So the submission globally becomes something you are able to do rather than the objective of why you are doing it. We have taken advantage of the developed countries for the past 30 years, where they have been submitting greenhouse gas inventory reports for that long. It was the huge burden that was put on them by developing countries when the convention was negotiated. They were the only ones who had to report, and they had to do it every year. And once every 2 years, the international hordes would descend on your country to make sure that you are living up to the obligations you gave. But surprise, surprise, the biggest supporters of that entire process was not the developing countries. It was the developed countries who were reporting. They figured out very early on, wow, with this knowledge, I can really increase our economic output. I can make the lives of my citizens better. And today, the number one driving factor in almost every developed country is climate. And they all built it from the fact that they had to report greenhouse gas inventories. Nowadays, the developing countries are following the same pathway. Oh, you mean I can actually see that this isn't working, stop spending my money on it, and spend my money on something else? My last comment with regards to what we understand transparency to mean. It means the ability to count. If you are able to count something, you can assign a specific value to it. My country, the Bahamas, and I had nothing to do with this brilliant idea, decided that even though they had virtually no land, they had more shallow water systems than the Amazon forest. And those shallow water systems absorb more carbon than the Amazon forest. But there was no way for them to take advantage of the fact that they fully intended to maintain the entire thing exactly the way it is. They determined the first thing they needed to do was to be able to count the absorptive capacity of their shallow water systems. Once they could count it, they could market it. And from what I understand, several billion US dollars a year in income from it. Simply because now they can count it. Right? So when you think of transparency, don't just think of reporting in the biennial transparency report or the biennial update reports or the biennial reports or RED Plus or national communications or greenhouse gas inventories. Think of it as building the ability to generate national development along the pathways that government wish it to go. So with that, I welcome you to our transparency event, and thank you all for giving me the opportunity to chat and get to know you a little better. Jessica.
Thank you, Don. Now I'd like to welcome to the podium Dr. Rolph Payet, Executive Secretary of the Secretariat of the Basel Convention, Rotterdam Convention, and the Stockholm Convention. Dr. Payet, the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias, Jessica, and thank you very much. At least I got a good introduction. Of course, when talking about transparency, I'm on the same wavelength as Don. People think of this boring subject of transparency and information sharing and reporting, but I think there is more fun into transparency when we start to unpack it. And hopefully I'll be able to do this with you this afternoon, because it's really a very important area of work that the conventions, especially the MEAs, focus on, but also I think, as Donna said, supporting countries in really addressing the challenges that they have. So I'm the Executive Secretary of the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions, and of course it's the first time we're appearing on this climate radar. And you might be wondering, what are these three conventions about? They're about climate change, basically, because climate change is about chemicals that you're putting into the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, methane, and whatever. Our conventions deal with those chemicals plus hundreds and thousands of other chemicals that are in products, in furniture, in clothing, in food, pesticides, industrial chemicals. And of course, some of them are beneficial for humans and for biodiversity, but some of them majority of them are quite dangerous. And our international conventions look at how we can manage, control, and also minimize the use, or in some cases ban those chemicals that are actually toxic to humans. And the three conventions work together in this what we call a life cycle approach, which means that from a cradle to grave, but this is a very old concept, but really looking at how we produce those chemicals, how they get turned into products, how they end up in the environment, or how do we close the loop so that it can go into other products, how we can also dispose of those wastes when they become waste in an environmentally sound manner. So this is just a crash course 101, 1 minute briefing on what we do in our conventions. Now, the Stockholm Convention deals with persistent organic pollutants, and these are really toxic chemicals. And you've heard of DDT before, you've heard of PCB before. This is the chemicals that are listed for complete phase out, which means that if you look at DDT today, there's only a couple of countries that have exceptional use of DDT for malaria control, and that's it. All the companies producing DDT in the world has closed down completely. There's only one, and that one is about to close down probably this year or next year. And this is the successes of this convention. So it's negotiated in that way. And of course, we are up to now 28 or so chemicals. We have groups of chemicals in which there are thousands of chemicals, like PFAS, for example, which is used in your anti-stick frying pans. You heard about it? These anti-stick frying pans that, is so convenient in the home, but these also have got toxic additives in there, and they are being slowly phased out and changed into much more ecological additives. And of course, the big elephant in the room is the plastics issue. And although plastics are really good, really useful, we've added a lot of additives to them. And many of these additives are toxic. So we need to find ways of moving them out. And this is where comes the interesting part of transparency. What is in our products? What is in the products? What is in your clothing? What is in this chair? Now, if you turn the label over, it tells you a nice chair made in XXX country. That's it. But you don't exactly know what's in there. What's in the lining? What are the components in there? So that means as consumers, we cannot make informed decisions on whether I want to buy this or whether I want to expose myself to this kind of product. And of course, nowadays, you can download an app and go into the shop and point your app to different products, and it will tell you what's in there. Well, not everything, but it's happening. And for me, that's the edge or the tip of the iceberg when we talk about transparency, because it helps us as consumers to make conscious decisions. Of course, we need to know about those chemicals and what impacts they have. So most of us don't have time to go and dig into chemistry books and find out what they are, what they do, where it ends up in the environment, how it accumulates in our body. These are all things that, okay, we keep it to all those chemists. But as we've seen, our world is increasingly becoming more information-oriented. So the fact that more information is required, more information is being used for making decisions, then the issue of transparency becomes very important. It's important and fundamental to trade. Our 3 conventions are actually trade-related conventions. It's no strange fact that we do work with, for example, the World Trade Organization, because trading chemicals, whether they are formed in commodities or products, pesticides, for example, industrial chemicals and all this, they form the basis of trade. And for you to have sound trade, you need to have sound information and transparent information being shared and exchanged. Unless you want to, of course, send a Trojan horse to your trading partner. You know what I mean by a Trojan horse? You put things there that you don't want and you put in there. And that comes to the problem of waste. We have a big global problem of waste because of lack of transparency. We've called everything we don't need waste. Where within those things that we just don't need, there are some that can be recycled and go, for example, aluminum can be recycled. There's some types of plastics that can be recycled, and there's the organic matter that can be composted. But if these products are all mixed together, then it becomes very hard. And I'll just give you an example, for example, in the recycling industry. You might think the recycling industry is just, taking all the waste and recycling them. No, it's actually very difficult for them, because if you send a mobile phone, for example, to a recycling company with the battery in there, it might cause an explosion. It might cause a fire. It might cause, toxic fumes to come out from there. So if you talk to a recycler, he'll tell you my biggest headache is when the waste I receive is not separated, and I don't know what are the components in that waste. So when I send it through my recycling plant, I end up with a lot of problems. Again, information. So if we look at another example before I get to where I'm getting in terms of how important it is, a manufacturer manufactures a product with different layers, different components, different chemicals and materials in there. And then when it comes to actual recycling, we don't know, because we don't know what's in there. So how can we take it apart? And also, we cannot feed back to industry and say, industry, you need to design this better. So when we talk about circular economy, transparency is fundamental. It's one of the fundamental building blocks of circular economy. So when then we come now to the climate change negotiations, obviously anything we're going to talk about, mitigation technology or even adaptation, we need to have the information about the technologies, the solutions, but also the impacts of the solutions that we're coming up with. So in my view, transparency is a powerful tool for building trust as well. So what have I got to hide? I show you what I have in my products. I show you what I'm doing. I show you what is the outcome of my technology. I'm showing you what is happening with my solution. So it helps to build trust. And this is something that we badly need in the negotiations. I've seen it not only in your negotiations where there's a lot of mistrust. We saw it with the discussion on the financing mechanism, for example, by the World Bank. The World Bank is to north, is not south enough, in the discussions on loss and damage. So all these perceptions really boils down to how transparent. The big question I ask myself is, World Bank, how transparent are you? How are you showing the rest of the world where your support and your assistance is going? So big question mark I put there. I said, we need to do work there. And this affects all international organizations, all MEA processes, as well as the discussions we have. So building trust for me is a fundamental aspect of the transparency process. Second one is, as mentioned by Don, the implementation of the goals. We set ourselves goals, with ourselves objectives. How do we move towards implementing those? And I think I work with governments as well and also companies. We have a problem. We all agree we have a problem. But once we own the problem and we say, yes, we are part of the solution as well, rather than become targeted as being the bad guy or the bad person in the room or the bad industry, I think this is where goals are set or targets are set, and we have industries that I'm setting a target, but then when you investigate, they haven't actually done anything. Just for the sake of feeling good, looking good, And what we call in our sector called greenwashing, for example, it's very common because industry wants to look good. They want to show that they are doing something, but actually not doing anything. So how do we fundamentally get them to put their feet where their mouth is, or their mouth where their feet is? I'm joking here, just to wake you up. But this is important because we need honest bona fide statements, honest bona fide goals, not only from countries, but also from industry, but also from stakeholders saying, look, I'm going to do this. We commit ourselves to do it, and we give ourselves a timeline, and we get it done. Same thing, we are failing on the SDGs, is the same thing. We've set ourselves 2030. Every year I hear the same story. We are not meeting the goals. We are not meeting the goals because we are not seriously committed to it. So it enables commitment as well. When we look at the issue of transparency, it helps us to become much more committed. It enables us to become more accountable, so we can point out who are the ones that are accountable, who are the ones who are lagging behind. Do they have needs? And this is one of the things we faced in the three conventions when dealing with the compliance mechanisms, for example. Many countries feel the compliance mechanism is like a police state action where a country is not meeting its obligations of the convention. That means we blacklist them or whatever. But turn the story around. It actually helps us to support those countries because through the whole exercise of collecting data on a country's performance, on a country's activities, we can identify gaps and areas where we can support them. And this also now brings me to the topic of national reporting as well. National reporting is not supposed to be identifying the black sheep of the family, in multilateralism. It's supposed to help us identify those countries that have needs and prioritize our resources, prioritize our efforts towards supporting those countries. And this is something that has really helped us in the three conventions to identify the priorities. For example, we had a big debate. I think Dawn probably remembered the endosulfan, serious. We wanted to phase out because endosulfan been found to be used, for example, in coffee, in cotton growing, and all this. And these were critical core economic sectors in those countries. So how do we shift those farmers from using a chemical they've been used to before, which is effective, cheap, easily deployed, to a much more environmentally sustainable approach? And of course, when you start unpacking this, you will start to understand transparency, information sharing, information collection, understanding the specific requirements of all those countries becomes so important. And I think transparency helps us to dig deep. Like we call it nowadays, deep dive. I'm going to finish in a minute. Don't worry, I'm nearly done. So I think when we think through this issue of transparency, it should not be as so boring as it is, because it really reaches deep into a country's economic development, capacity, both technological, human, and financial, as well as its ability to be able to implement challenges of an international convention. The final point I wanted to raise is, of course, we have a global monitoring system, because there's no point saying we're phasing out this chemical, phasing out this process and whatever, if we cannot measure the effectiveness of it, right? And if we take DDT, for example, DDT is a long-range transport, so we've been finding it in polar bears, for example, in the Arctic. We find it in distant locations where DDT has never been used, which means that it is transported. And DDT is a chemical that doesn't degrade into the environment that fast. So have our efforts benefited the environment is what we've measured. But the problem is the major monitoring stations are all in the north. If you look at monitoring stations around the world, they are clustered in the US, clustered in Europe, and that's it. And you have little spots around the world. So transparency is also our ability to collect data globally, but also have access to this data and be able to use this data to give us the results. For example, I talked about the SDGs. Are we making progress in the implementation of the convention? And if we are not, what do we need to do to make progress? And for me, the availability of monitoring stations, for example, for our three conventions is very, very important. Now we're looking at international treaty on plastics. I hope we put in place systems that will help us to measure that actually the measures we're taking at the national level, at the global level, is actually causing a reduction in plastics on distant places in the islands, in the Arctic, and whatever. And it's important. And for me, that's another important component of transparency activities. So let's find a nice name for it. I like the T4T. I think we can call it tea that you drink and T4T. Because, you know, countries also have an adverse understanding of transparency. Companies have an adverse, because also companies don't want, and in our field is very critical, because if you can prove that this chemical is causing cancer, is causing problems there, of course the industry certainly have the team of lawyers coming over and say, no, we are not responsible because you cannot prove this. And of course they are liable, there's liability issues raised with that. So there are these extremes, and we need to deal with these perceptions and help industry to be comfortable to share information, because they are also afraid they might become liable. And finally, what has emerged now with artificial intelligence and progress information sharing, we have what we call dashboards, and we use it a lot. It's developing in our conventions, where it's a visualization tool. So in a way, we try to hide the specific information, not for any other purpose, but to allow industry to come forward, to allow governments to come forward. And it's important, because then they feel they are not being targeted or being the black sheep. So you see the big picture, you see the important areas, but you're not able to go a bit deeper, at least in the public facing part of the dashboards, to allow, you know, problems of liability and all this. And I think we have to be realistic in the world today that there is a lot of sensitivity to this. So for us to be able to move forward in a very practical way, I think the dashboards can really help us. And also it can help us find linkages between what UNFCCC is doing and what we are doing in the chemicals arena. And of course, we will be joining the team of experts. We are working together with the UNFCCC so that we can share expertise, but also have our experts as well join, because there's a lot of, a simple example is a coal-powered generator. Produces also traces of mercury, and mercury is covered in the Minamata Convention. So joint visits can help both at reducing, for example, emissions, addressing emissions, but also at addressing the emissions of chemicals into the environment. I will stop here. As you can see, this is something I'm passionate about, but thank you so much for inviting me to talk to you on this very important issue. And of course, this is a very exciting initiative by UNFCCC, and very happy to collaborate and cooperate with the Secretariat on this one. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Payet. Thank you. And I think with these two powerful messages, we are in perfect shape to kick off the conversation. And I'd like to introduce to you my two panelists of today. Here at my right, we have Xiye Bastida, climate justice activist and co-founder of Re-Earth Initiative. And we have Daniel Truran, board member of B-Lab Europe. Please help me welcome them. Great, so now we've heard some messages and insights about transparency, what does it mean for consumers, for parties, for media, for the broad society. And I'd like to begin with a very broad question, but in a few words, if possible. And I would like to ask you, what does transparency mean in the context of climate change?
So, surprisingly enough, for companies, transparency has become a risk. It's a horrible thing to say, but it's true, because the more companies share what they're doing, inevitably they're attacked for good reasons. And at B Corp, we think that is not right. So I think there should be something that you share with transparency that is worth sharing. Now, the methodology is called measure what matters. And to me, that's really the important part, that you can see with transparency any kind of results that a B Corp has had. So you can see the 5 indicators very clearly. You can see exactly what they're doing right and what they're doing wrong. And that's the kind of transparency that you need to make that credible. And the second element is how this assessment that's used by 250,000 companies actually works. It's co-created. And co-creating something ensures a very much higher level of transparency. Co-creating the assessment every 2 years, the whole world is engaged in an open dialogue that tries to improve this methodology and make it more relevant and more important. So moving from risk to something you can proudly share and showing all that you're doing wrong, I think that's really what we would like to think is the right transparency.
To stop seeing transparency as a risk, but rather an opportunity. When we have data that we can trust, we also can see solutions and as the UN says, foster radical collaboration with companies or other groups of society that we don't think could be as an obvious relationship where we can find some opportunities for the climate space. Thank you. And what about you, Xiye? What do you think? What does it mean, transparency in the context of climate change?
Hello. Oh, amazing. Hello, everyone. It's so nice to be here. Thank you for having me. I think for climate activists, transparency is exactly why it's a risk for businesses, right? Because when we have transparency, we know what to ask for. We know what to lobby for. And for me, activism is the practice of imagining and being creative of a different world that doesn't put people and the future at risk. So for me, that's why transparency is so necessary and should be mandatory across all governments, all sectors, all businesses, because if we don't know what to ask for, we don't know where we can go. And so we understand why it's a risk for businesses, but at the same time, I think we're at a point where we cannot afford to not know the truth. We cannot afford to not be honest with each other, and we cannot afford to not even, I think you see yourselves as disruptors of the business space in a way. And I think a lot of chief sustainability officers see themselves as activists in certain spaces, especially in their own companies. But they cannot probably go themselves and tell their CEO, you have to change this and this and this, fear of being fired or whatever it is. So all of these transparency frameworks can help for there to be outside pressure and for there to be the activism that is needed on the outside and on the inside to actually get to where we need to be. So I think transparency is the through line for honesty and for accountability and be able to measure success.
And also a bit on the responsibility that companies have, that or those who report, chief sustainability officers. No, we also touch upon a sense that transparency can also mean responsibility of sharing reliable data and things that then activists can later use. And in your two areas of work, because this is the richness of this panel, that we can have two different perspectives. What benefits do you see? What tangible benefits do you see when we foster transparency?
Well, a clear one is trust. When you really know what you're sharing with full transparency, the trust that you create with people is unique. And I think it's also very important to talk about communities, yeah? We talk about co-creating things. So in the B Corp movement, for example, we see that when people are sharing with each other, they're helping each other. There's startups, there's huge multinationals, there's very young people, there's older people who maybe should change their ways. You see this across the board, these movements. And that's where it's important. It's just one company, two companies, five, you're exposed. But then when there's a movement of thousands of companies that really are strictly measured by what really matters and proudly say, I am one of the best companies for the world, things change. And what you're talking about, the motivation, and the motivation is not just the CEO, it's not just the young activist that comes to the company. In the past, still exists. You got this sustainability office. It's usually very green. Nobody uses plastic in the office. It's up on the 10th floor. That doesn't work. The whole company, from the cleaning person to everybody else in the company, has to feel it, has to feel part of it, has to feel a pride in this transparency, in what you're creating. And if you measure this, so how good is your company? What about yours? How good is yours? How good is yours? If you have a number, which the B Corp movement really provides, then you can really compare and create a competition for good. And that's what companies need. They need to compete for good. Right now, they've competed to have a biggest simple number, profits. There's a much wider way of going forward. And now we're seeing the proof that this really works with these new business models that make profits. Otherwise, the company doesn't exist, but not despite everything else, because they're good companies, because they move forward. And when it's a movement of companies that do that, a movement of people that do that, you're strengthened, you're helping each other. You see really a acceleration of impact, which is exactly what we're trying to push at all ages.
Do you want to comment on that, or?
Yeah, I think, and I think this also goes on the topic of transparency also means transparency on challenges. And I think that's why companies usually don't want to be or they don't want to share too much of the bad things. They only want to share the good things. And sometimes there is even resources that go into greenwashing. And I mean, for me, B Corp, every time I see the B Corp stamp, I feel like a sigh of relief. You know what I mean? Like, if I see a company that I don't know about and it has B Corp, I know I can trust it a little bit more, or actually a lot more. So it's a standard that you're setting, and it's a really important standard, because when we see companies, and you know, that's just such a broad term, if we don't know what they're struggling with, then we don't know what we can push for. And then that's where I think a lot of them fall into greenwashing. And I think what they forget is that when they greenwash, they're losing our trust. And it just doesn't make sense to lose somebody's trust when you can be honest about what the challenges are so that we can move forward together. A few months ago in UN Climate Week, the World Economic Forum convened 10 activists and 10 companies together. And I was there among the group of youth activists. And the companies were not your usual suspects. It wasn't Patagonia or IKEA or the ones who are already engaging with youth activists. It was P&G, MasterCard, Meta. You know, it was companies that are not necessarily like on their full sustainability or transformative pathways. And what we told them is, well, first of all, you need a youth advisory, because I think youth need to be in every single space for a company to be able to think about a future. Because if you have people in your company who are thinking of the year 2100 because their grandkids are going to be alive then I think you're ensuring that your company has some longevity beyond your quarters or whatever it is, right? And what surprised me was that one of the companies said, I had never ever thought of having a conversation with a youth activist. And another one said, why does it have to be an activist? Why can't it just be a young person? And I said, it's because you have to ask yourself if you're willing to be challenged. Are you willing for somebody on your team who works with you to ask you the hard questions? And only with the hard questions can we get to the right answers. So yeah, that's just a bit of like how we have tried to push companies and just tell them it's a no-brainer to actually think of the future and think of what is going to be your biggest market. 87% of people under 30 live in the global south, which is usually the place that is most affected by pollution and industrialization and just, you know, low regulations where companies can do whatever.
Thank you, Xiye, and thank you for asking the hard questions. I know you do this a lot, and this is why you're one of the most recognized activists in the climate space. And I want to keep the conversation with you for a bit, because I would like to talk about your organization, Re-Earth Initiative, because you focus on the intersectionality of climate change activism. And I want to ask how transparency can help bring a more inclusive climate movement.
That's a really, really important question, because when I first started going to COPs, which was COP25, 95% of the youth activists were from Europe, because it was in Spain, because it was, you know, easy to get there, because most of the information on climate is in English. About more than 70% of climate information is in English. So there's just no knowledge, there's no resources, and there is just so many barriers. And I think what we wanted to do at Re-Earth Initiative was decentralize the climate movement in a way and say, there are people from all over the world that not only have stories of what the climate crisis could do, but what it has been doing. And if we don't have the voices of the people that have been affected, when we're imagining different worlds, we're gonna ignore what the challenges can be. And that's what's happening with the green revolution. You know, if we're mining lithium and constructing a new system off of another mode of extraction without including the people who are going to be affected, then we really, really have to ask ourselves, what world are we building, and if we're changing any paradigms. And so that's why it's so important to show that the climate movement is this fully diverse body of people from all over the world, that at the end of the day, we want to create the solutions that are as holistic as we are. And I think that is the key. And transparency for me, what it really means is creating a full picture. And I see all of the little drawings of the global stocktake in the back. And you know, the global stocktake is also about that, showing us the reality of where we are and the truth of where we are. And if we don't have a clear picture of where we are, we cannot even think of where we can be. So yeah, my organization, you know, we give grants to frontline communities to do restoration projects. We translate to 5 different languages. We have youth in 27 countries. We're trying to change what it means to be a youth activist.
Thank you, Xiye. Daniel, I want to bring out the salesperson in you. I want to hear, how can you convince companies to join the B Corp movement? Because I want to talk about reporting. Sometimes companies see reporting as a burden of a huge process, and they complain, so many information they need to gather. And I want to hear from you, what do you say to them? How can transparency systems, as your certification, can actually help the private sector to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, and to make a better, to keep on moving with the climate action and the climate commitment? What do you say to them?
So first thing, and just to show you how better salesmen are, do not become a B Corp. Instead, in Spanish we say ser B. Don't be a B Corp with the certification and everything else, just be B, which is much more important. So the assessment is for free. Any company can look at it, join it, look at their score, improve, find ways forward without becoming a B Corp. B Corp is a bit of the lead, you know, the top of the top is not necessary. Companies desperately need to understand what being B means, what really have in their DNA this way of working, because we're showing that it works. What has happened in the last 10 years, we co-founded Build Up Europe 11 years ago now. Then it was all greenwashing, to be honest with you. It were all companies that knew what they had to do, but they were not really going forward. What is happening now is green wishing, which is a huge shift from write something about it, about how can I do this? Last May in Amsterdam, with people from all over the world, 1,200 CEOs gathered for 2 days to study how can we move this forward. The majority B Corps and many who wanted to be B, saying how can we move forward? In my life, I've never seen so many CEOs stop for 2 days to say, how can I be a better company? How can my company go forward? And the energy that created is unstoppable. And again, companies need to say, this works. You know, I'm not going to be a fool and just step into the depth. And so this works, this model works, and then these people together really find a way forward. And that energy, that certainty, that going forward, again, you do not have to be a B Corp, but please be B, because that is the essence of changing things around and really bringing I think it's a sense of pride. You know? Why are these companies more successful than the average? You know, Patagonia, Natura, EcoAlf, all these companies, why are they so cool and successful? Because people that work there says, I'm proud to work there. Imagine all your staff is proud to work there. What happened? Much more productive, much more exciting, much more connected, and it goes forward. Again, not B Corp, is BB.
I'm saying, on that point, you know, I go to UPenn, which has the largest business school in the US, the Wharton School of Business, and everybody there wants to end up in Wall Street or in consulting. But I have seen a shift, even though I'm like one of 12 environmental studies majors in this full, like my full generation. We are making a shift in there, in that there's petitions going around with my peers saying, I will not work for a fossil fuel company. I will not work for a banking that, you know, like a bank that does this or that. And it's just to see that the top talent of youth in universities right now, we're all organizing across the world to choose where we want to work and choose that, and like know that now we don't really have to compromise like a salary for a job, because the money going into the renewable energy sector and the sustainability sector and sustainable fashion, etc., is increasing, because we are just not willing to put our talent in any company that is destroying the world any longer. And every person that has been my roommate, that was all randomized, they'll all switch their majors to be sustainability and environmentally related. And that is what we're doing to each other as a generation. We're really shifting the way that we want to operate in the world and the legacy that we want to leave. And these shoes are also B Corp. I just wanted to say.
No, and it's also important here, the transparency, because for people entering the workforce, without transparency, how can we find information of where we want to direct our professional careers to, right? So I think transparency also plays a role in here. So I'd like to open the floor for one question, because we don't have much time. If you want to raise a question to the panelists and be brief. No questions? I am sure you will have questions at the end of the panel, and you can approach our panelists. Well, we're bringing this event then to a close. Not before, I would like to reflect on some of the impact that we received today. We've heard that transparency is a tool for parties, but also for consumers, for activists, for businesses. We heard that transparency builds trust in the process of the Paris Agreement, especially now with the transition to the enhanced transparency framework. I love the fact of changing the perception of risk to opportunity, how transparency is actually the way to do that. And last but not least, what Together for Transparency stands for, which is transparency builds community, and we engage all groups of society, and that's why you're here. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you all for attending this session. Thank you very much.